All right, this is MapChat. Today I'm joined by AlphaOwl, who's the creator of Taisha, which is a contest map for the Big Adventure contest at Mapcore. Yeah, so how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, so how did you get into Counter Strike originally? I think it's good to get a vision of sort of your engagement with the game, and then we'll sort of move into mapping.
well, I think I got introduced to Counter-Strike back in 2014 by my friends. I had some older childhood friends, and they started to really get into the game. I was starting off playing TF2 at first, so it seemed very kind of natural for me to transition from one Valve game to another. And I'm actually going to be hitting up my 10th anniversary soon because I
Nice.
got the game back in Christmas. But I remember when I first started, I was scared shitless about like how serious it all felt. I even remember like leaving my first comp match midway because of just how intimidated I felt about it. Um, but I did eventually warm up to playing the game a lot more, especially when I started kind of having more friends that played the game during middle school.
Yeah, nice one. Yeah, so do you remember the first map you ever played?
um, I do remember my first comp match was on Inferno, like old Inferno.
That's
Um,
pre Orange Inferno, right? Like when there was still
yeah,
like the
pre
logs
remake.
and yeah.
Yeah. So it was like it was the one where like Banana was like super had like the weird arch and everything.
Mm.
And it was obviously there's the bedroom and the broken wood and everything. Playing that map was crazy. I even remember like I don't think I was around for Old Train, but I pretty much they started remaking all the maps just around then or so.
Yeah.
So I got like a taste of like how like the old retro CS in some ways before they started making it better.
Yeah, I mean the reason I ask is I just my first map was Cobblestone, the first map I ever played, and I think that
Ooh.
influenced my mapping quite a lot. So I just wondered if you feel like it's the same for you, whether Inferno, because Taisha definitely has a sort of Inferno-y feel, sort of a mix of visually and uh, yeah. Do you feel like it has had an influence on your future maps?
I wouldn't say necessarily. I would say that like I usually try to base my kind of game design of the maps based around just like kind of my experience playing um just so many CS matches and just playing all the maps basically. So I like to emphasize kind of unique aspects of just like, oh, this is how a certain map is played, and what's a nice twist that you could possibly turn on that will make the map still fun with that while still retaining some sort of originality to it.
Mm.
Um, so that's kind of I would say like in some ways like I do like to approach like certain things that may seem just like unfun just from a glance, but like I want to be able to tweak it just so that it's just right where it could work, basically.
Yeah, have you got anything that springs to mind of sort of an idea that you were particularly interested in, and it sort of took some iterations to get working?
Let's see. And does this have to be specifically about Taisha or just
No, no,
like
no.
in general?
Any maps you've done before as well, or even if it was just an idea that you never quite got round to doing.
I remember one of my earlier maps called I think I just named it like Asclepius. I it was like super fast paced. Usually like the mid was like very like squarish, but like contact times would probably be around like um 4 seconds or so, and you could just get to like a site within like less than 10 seconds. It's very quick paced map and everything. I really enjoyed playing that with friends, but I never really got it off the floor. But that's something I do want to kind of like I did quite enjoy just because of like just how fast the engagements were. It kind of works in some ways, like how Wingman does. And there's
Mm.
another map that I worked on that I was kind of joking around with, kind of the concept of where I just chose like really obscure like fight concepts. So, for instance, one bomb site was literally just like a bunch of like blocks in a row basically that you could just kind of sweep in and out of,
All right, yeah.
or just like another one where you basically were finding on top of like a little balcony connected to like a large-ass tree, and so there would kind of be like some verticality height dynamics where you'd have to like kind of be careful where like people were coming out of and everything. And I think probably my favorite part about that map was like I was very set in stone on trying to create like a gunfight in an elevator shaft basically that wouldn't feel like too overwhelming or like too overpower or too quintessential to have
Hmm.
power of. So like it would, I think I connected that elevator shaft to like middle to like one of the sites. So it's like if one of the players want to retake from there, they could like scale up the elevator shaft or just jump from top to bottom basically. And it's just kind of stuff like that though, where I think like okay, I feel like in the most conventional level this really shouldn't work, but like if you're able to just tweak it just right, like it's definitely doable. Like I think it doesn't need to be like so overwhelmingly like obtuse and just like overpowered for just trying to or just unfair basically as like part of the map.
Yeah. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about your mapping, game design background? From what I understand, you study game design. Is that right?
Yes, I do. I think it probably originated originally from my dad kind of just working at a video game company. I think that really took a lot of that inspired me a lot early on. He worked more like on the technical side of trying to maintain servers, but
Hmm.
just like as a young kid, hearing or just imagining my dad works at a video game company was something that just really struck a chord with me, and I was like, I wanted to do that. Um, in terms of like mapping though, I started mapping kind of for TF2 in 2016.
Hmm.
But in general, I really just wanted to kind of get my foot into just working on video games in the first place. So I tried getting into like animating on like SFM, but I just found it way too difficult
Mm.
as I started to kind of get better. So then I transitioned to mapping, and then then I transitioned to CS mapping specifically because I kind of found designing like layouts for TF2 was just kind of much more difficult.
Mm.
Whereas in CS, you don't have to worry about balancing for like nine different classes on a single map, basically. You just
Mm.
have to, throw some bomb sites around, have some reasonable sight lines, and
It's more
just have
condensed with
certain.
Counter Strike as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, TF2, you have to just like create a sprawling thing.
Mm.
And I think for me, as like a middle high schooler, it was just like kind of too much to kind of keep in mind to really like execute a single vision on. So yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about some previous maps you've done. Were those ones that sort of got you saw all the way through, or did they sort of get stuck and you started them, sort of got somewhere? Do you want to tell us, just a little bit about your previous mapping experience before Taisha, and any standouts that you've got?
Yeah, sure. Um yeah, so I would say that some of the ones are my very first CS map in Go was this map I called Catacombs basically. I try to set it in like kind of in like Paris, and you try to go
All
through
right, yeah,
like the Paris catacombs and whatnot. But
that's a cool
it was
setting.
just kind of yeah, it was kind of just an absolute mess. The routing throughout the map was like way too like a site sided, and it was just also the complexity was just too extreme. That also just contributed to kind of the lack of cohesion throughout like the entire map style. So like I had like a very traditional mid, but then there were like three routes leading to a site, and there was also like separate buildings and whatnot. And so I very quickly opted to redesign the layout or like a new layout with like kind of a similar vibe to the first one, but that layout itself also had like its own flaws. So I
Mm.
eventually just kind of dropped it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting
Um,
when you talk about it being overly complex. I think that's an interesting thing of when you see, especially first-time mappers. They'll bring their map to a playtest on Mapcore or whatever, and there's so many like ideas that people have put in. Did you find that that was the issue you had of needing to learn how to reduce options?
I definitely think so. I think that like mindset carried on with me for a while, especially when I was trying to, especially with like some of my more like, I guess some of my more popular apps in some ways, because I'm just like I have like so many ideas that I want to kind of like implement into it, and then I have like a solution, but the solution is just pretty much like a complete redesign. So then I keep on reiterating more and more, and it completely just like changes the map. And I think it's good that there's like creativity when it comes to when it comes to map making and you're trying to try out new things. But I think at the same time you have to like save some of those ideas just for like another time, or like as like just a necessity when need be. Otherwise it's just gonna completely just like change the map, and it just
Mm.
like it's too much basically, and you have to kind of find the right balance into just having enough where you don't need to do more than you really need to.
Yeah, so you started off with catacombs. It was a bit sprawly, but it sounds like you sort of had a general idea of map making technique, sort of a middle. And so where did you move from that?
um I made a couple other ones like I did eventually move on to making that Asclepius map, and then also I made this one that I was inspired from an escalation video that was like supposed to be like off of like a Russian rocket silo. But I think the map that I'm probably most proud of, which I actually kind of care about a lot, is Villaggio, which is kind of like this Italian-based map set in kind of like a sprawling like little town. And this was probably the map that I was the closest to being fleshed out, but I also found myself, like I said earlier, kind of just making the layout more and more intricate as time
Hmm.
went on to try to find like proper solutions to balance it. And then but I think also I really was passionate about just trying to get this one right was because um back when I was making it, FM Pone was hosting kind of a feedback on your levels
Oh right,
review
okay.
thing, and I was able to get mine submitted to him, and he actually seemed to like it. So that was a big highlight for me as kind of an aspiring
Yeah,
level
imagine. Yeah.
designer. And so I ended up making like little a little tribute like flower shop for him there, and kind of implemented some of his suggestions. So like he suggested like this weird underpass thing or underpass window where you could peek from under a hole and you have visibility over like a sight line basically, and I implemented that. And yeah, but I think just overall I've like kind of ended up making like three different versions of the map. um and so like even going into CS2 I decided to start from scratch, because it's just one of those projects that really means a lot to me, and
Hmm.
it's why I keep on coming back to it. But like I remember when I first initially drew up the map design, I had like an idea for it, and then when I eventually did implement it into Hammer, it like very much completely like was reshaped.
Yeah.
So when I was making the second version for it, I was trying to mesh it closer to that, and then eventually with the third version was kind of like, okay, let me mesh it back to the first version that I had put on the workshop, but also with the original concept, so that way it's a nice balance between both. Just
Hmm.
because I felt like on paper some of it just didn't like work out as well as it did when I made the second version.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty happy where I went with it now. I do have like kind of a gray box version up on the workshop right now, and I also have like a better idea of like as to the theme as to like how the map is kind of presented too. So I think that definitely helps.
Hmm. Yeah, you bring up an interesting point when you're saying so. FM doing these feedback sessions, give you some advice. What is your general philosophy when it comes to taking feedback? Because I feel like that's one of the hardest things to get a grip of in map making. Is everyone's taste is so subjective. Like learning what to take from people and learning when to go back to your original idea. So, sort of, what's your philosophy around that?
Um, I think it really depends on how passionate you are about like that certain part of the map, basically. Like when it comes to Taisha, and more specifically, I'm gonna like kind of like dive a little bit into like
Yeah, go
kind
for
of
it.
like differences between like the feedback and whatnot. But when it comes to Taisha, I had a very clear idea of like what I wanted to be like big parts of the map. Like honestly, if I think about it, like there are probably only like two big parts of the map that remain the same over time generally, and that would be A site and T spawn. Everything else has been like shaped over time by like lots of feedback. So I remember when I first made the map, it was like I conceptually there was the middle had like this one building in there that you there would kind of be two paths that you just go around basically just to like take mid control, and it was just way too. I thought it was fine at first, but then when I had my first playtest on it, it was just way too overwhelming for CTs to
Hmm.
control at all. So so I just ended up completely scrapping the entire thing, and I'm just like, okay, I couldn't go with that. And I remember B side as well was just like this very small, like kind of like currently the bottom site right now is like a gazebo, but originally imagine that like whole area was much smaller and it was just like a more of a building centered in the middle, and you just that was all you're playing around. It was basically like a pillar site like
Mm.
design, and it was just kind of people didn't really like it because it just was it felt very condensed and there wasn't much of a fight to be honest. So then kind of reworking that, or I got suggestions to kind of rework that as well, and I'm much more satisfied. Just I think like there are different ways to definitely approach like the feedback because you also have to think about the perspective as to where the players are coming from. I'm gonna get a little personal with this, but
Go for it.
I do believe that in some ways it is very quintessential to get the feedback from both playtesters and people on the hub for very different reasons. Because I think when it comes to getting playtests from like from like other mappers and whatnot, they're kind of coming from the more like first impressions, more generalist fundamentals of Counter Strike, where they understand like the basic fundamentals as to how
Hmm.
something should work, but they don't really think more beyond that, basically. Or they don't. It doesn't. It takes them more time to kind of pick up on some of these things. Um, but I do think, on the other hand, though, you have the people on the hub where they have played the game like countless of hours. They've played through each map like 100 times each, and they can pick up really fast. They could pick up like what is how this should work in like a more like in a more serious competitive level where everyone knows what they're doing
Hmm.
basically. So they'll try to come up with like smokes as soon as possible, and they'll realize like, oh, we should be stacking more towards this, we should be stacking more towards that. And I feel like when you get like a private playtest, you're not going to get that initially because people are more set in stone in terms of like, oh, maybe we just play traditionally 2-1-2-1-2, and they won't pick up on that until later on, but that will affect their playtest so much that they will think that the map is not working right.
Yeah. How
But
do you feel like that's affected by playtesters are very often mappers themselves? Do you think that has an impact?
in terms of like how so?
In the way that they approach, so like you were saying, they have a generalized view of how fundamentals should work. Do you think that the fact that they're very often map makers themselves, do you think that impacts how they then view other people's maps in terms of like generalized rules that they've made for themselves?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's why I really like to kind of personally verge like into kind of the more like let's take like a fundamental thing that you wouldn't like necessarily have and try to make it work. And I think that's like why I kind of do appreciate my approach to that, just because I think so many other people generally uh have like a very set in stone way of like approaching certain things. Like, oh, mid I remember in comparison when I did eventually change up mid to kind of be like a very small lane-ish basically, where people were just like fighting like this really direct fight, and it was just like a back and forth of nades. And I remember I really liked it because people on the hub really liked it basically.
Mm-hmm.
But then throughout all my like personal like playtest, so many people just did not really like the vibe of it, or they had trouble like really understanding it. And I think it just kind of goes to show just like they won't really pick up on it, and they are more of like the traditionalist view that mid should be like this way basically, instead of we have all these other fights elsewhere, and that's where you have to prioritize, like this is where we need to set up the fights for that to work.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like on one I'm working on at the moment, there's a bit where there's a drop down, and a lot of the feedback I've got is, "Oh, I can't play on this drop down very easily," and my thinking is, yeah, because you're supposed to drop down it. You're not supposed to be able to play on it, and then there'll be, "Oh, well, I have to make noise." I'm like, yeah, because this is the short way around. You should go the long way around if you don't want to make noise. And it's taken quite a lot of iterations for that to become clear when I keep not changing it. Yeah, so I sort of get what you mean with that. Do you have a general mapping philosophy when it comes to what your aim is? So I know when I came into it, what my aim was, I want to get a map competitively viable. I'm not a big fan of the current map pool that's in competitive play, and so I wanted a map that was competitively viable, that was more to my taste than the current maps in the pool. And so I was like, well, I'll just make it then. I'll make one that I like, that I would want to see in the game. But obviously some people they want to make a map that's fun, they want to make a map that's interesting. Some people who come from a environment design background really care a lot about what it looks like. We saw that with the Panlong creator,
Yeah.
where like he was posting all the time this really beautiful map work, and then it didn't really work as a map, from what I understand. I never played it, but obviously really great environment designer. He's been working with a lot of teams in the contest. Where do you fall along that spectrum?
I think I definitely fall within the perspective of, I would say I definitely lean towards like trying to make a map very competitive, because I do imagine that hopefully one day I could
Mm-hmm.
see my map on the big stage at tournaments. Um,
Do you have that in
but
your mind when you're doing it? Of
I think,
thinking, how would this play in a, can I imagine a really cool moment on this?
yeah, I think that's definitely like, it depends. Like I usually try to like like depending on like the vibe. I kind of like, my ambitions are kind of like specifically set for like each map that I have in
Mm-hmm.
mind. But like for instance with Taisha specifically, I've definitely tried to target more of like, I want this to be very competitively viable, and I want
Mm-hmm.
them, each engagement, to seem like reasonable, to say the least, just so that it doesn't feel like, oh, this is like too overpowered, or people are gonna pick up on this really quickly and they could like abuse this.
Mm-hmm.
But something like, oh, they could like slowly work this out in some ways. Um, but I think like in general, I would say that my approach is definitely more like trying to balance the map first and foremost, just to see like, hey, does this part of the map work? Does this part of the map work? Does this part?
Mm-hmm.
And just trying to make sure that all the fights seem fun, basically. Because if it's not like considered balanced, before anything else, then like it doesn't feel worth it to me, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do think like I will like include some like fun aspects depending on like unique fights in some ways. Like I do try to kind of focus up on that. I think that was definitely something I picked up from when I was working on, when I got my feedback from Velagio. Just kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
it's fun to work on just like non-unique fights, and but just trying to make that work in the first place.
Yeah, when you say
Um, yeah.
balance, do you have obviously I you mean sort of balance in making sure every fight feels right. In terms of balance CT to T side, what's your view on that? Because historically, the era you started, and it's similar era to when I started, you used to have train, you know, you'd have a what would be more 10-5 half, pretty standard on train. Nuke 13-2, pretty standard. Uh, yeah, I'm sure there were some other ones. Cobblestone was pretty one-sided, if I remember. You had these maps that were very one-sided on either CT or T side, and you could bring it back if you moved sides. Do you have a view? Yeah, sort of. How do you feel about that kind of weighting from side to side, or do you aim for the sort of standard that we have at the moment, which is really every map is more or less fully balanced. Anubis is a bit T-sided, Nuke technically a bit CT-sided, but not, it doesn't have the same margins that it used to.
Yeah, I think definitely I'm in the camp of more so that like I think maps should generally be like CT sided just as a nature, but there should be moments where it doesn't feel like one side is specifically overpowering the other based off of like how much map control they have and like how many opportunities they have basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think Anubis works the way that it does because like you have so much control with like water and kind of pretty much with mid as well, especially within like the mid to late round, where you can kind of just like work these spaces and CTs have to like peek into you basically, and it makes it feel less challenging,
Mm-hmm.
or it makes it more troublesome for CTs to even take the risk. But the times that the CTs do though, they could really like stop the momentum that T's get on the map because of how quick the rotates are, and they could really like take advantage of that to kind of turn the tide into their favor and to kind of break the philosophy that the map is T-sided. It's just like you just have to make the right play basically.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's kind
Go on.
of the same way I think about the kind of my map balance as well. Like, there's if the right play is made, you could definitely just like win it for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, how do you feel about three lane as a concept?
Um, I think it definitely is something that I default to quite often, but I am trying to kind of branch out like away from myself. Um, but I guess I don't find too many issues with it. It is kind of just like the general blueprint of
Mm-hmm.
most CS maps. But I think in terms of like how you route around like the three lane is definitely interesting. I am not too fond of kind of like the philosophy that some I think certain map makers have, where I feel like they kind of go for more like four lane-ish, five lane-ish, and it kind of just like the map looks and feels overwhelming just because you
Mm-hmm.
have to take multiple connectors. And I feel like sometimes you don't really need to do all that work just to um make just to make the like them it could feel fine. The fight will feel fine, but like doesn't need to have this much to really like kind of engage on this fight. Like I think most times you could just simplify it as it simply just being a route to bomb site basically.
Mm.
And yeah, I think some people it's kind of a little bit part of like the ambition part, I think. And I mean, it could work. It's just that there's just way too much stuff to be looking at. And I think that's why Green Lane consistently stays like popular because of just like having to being able to kind of double up or at worst triple up towards like one part of the map just to like really focus fire on something versus needing to have everyone spread and make it feel like Valorant in some ways, which I think some people might have that kind of approach in, which works for Valorant, but it doesn't really work for CS.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, that's interesting. Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about the origins of Taisha and sort of you've spoken a little bit about it, but sort of a comprehensive. When did you start it? Did you have reference images in mind first? Did you have the theme in mind, or did you uh, discover all that after the layout?
Well, last winter break, I kind of took a trip to Japan with my parents, and it was my first time there or to Japan or Asia for that matter, and I just felt like that entire trip was just amazing, especially when we went to go check out like a lot of the places around like the Kyoto and Osaka area. I was like super inspired. And so I started wanting to draft up like a layout kind of in the middle of my trip, but I only really finished halfway before I could really fully
Mm-hmm.
flesh it out. It was only when the contest got like announced that I decided to draft up something like more fleshed out, just so that I can get a head start on what I envisioned the map to be. Because I did want to kind of be just like in the mindset like, okay, I'm gonna start this project and I'm gonna see it through. And kind of ironically enough, I was kind of working on like one of my previous competition map layouts, which I submitted for like exotic or for the Exotic Places Challenge
Yeah.
in 2019. I was planning to remake that, but right before they announced this contest, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna have to put that on the back burner. But I really hated kind of the idea of like revisiting an old project for the contest, which is kind of why I opted to make Taisha. I usually
Mm-hmm.
have like a list of like old map concepts basically, or not old map concepts, but just like map concepts that I have in mind
Yeah, yeah,
specifically.
yeah.
And I think like my approach to this, I think like what inspired me, especially with like Kyoto and Osaka, was like the more traditional like establishment of it. Whereas I feel like more people when they do make like there are a couple other Japanese maps in the competition right now, but I feel like they definitely center some of them have centered a lot more towards like kind of Tokyo and but we've already seen that before. We already have like Akiba, for instance, as like one of the maps, or we have like just like a couple other ones that are just more based in like like center of Tokyo,
Hmm.
and I want to kind of go with a more traditional um, vibe that you don't really see as often. Um, for Christmas, we visited this shrine called Fushimi Inari. The experience there was just very nice, and something about the shrine just kind of really struck a chord with me. It's kind of what inspired me to make a majority of the B side of the map, actually. And in earlier iterations, I try to replicate that as like accurately as possible. And it's also where I kind of got the name of the map from, since Taisha is kind of a classification of great shrines in Japan,
Right.
and
Okay.
the Fushimi Inari is like one of them, basically. The A side of the map was kind of also the same way too, where I had based it off of like an onsen I visited called Biwako Ryoku Sute in Ogata Onsen. It's kind of like this place, like kind of close to kind of Kyoto area. And though the finalized layout and art direction kind of differ from the original building, the layout of Bomb Site A is still was heavily inspired by an
Right.
onsen pool found within the facility. Um, yeah, I think definitely like the earliest iterations of the map in its like gray box stages were like the closest, most accurate versions because I really wanted to try to emulate that as much as possible. But it's sometimes, as I said before, like when you try to make it as accurate, it just doesn't really carry over,
Hmm.
and it just shows that sometimes it can't be fully adapted to make a fun experience. And so I've just tried to really, I've like taken the time to just like kind of rebalance it and like take suggestions from like others to really help me shape the map. And I think like the way that we usually go about it as well has just been like really like been able to like look at it from another perspective that really helps. And I think I have a better idea of like how to take my feedback now and to implement and change it versus like needing to completely redesign something for the most part.
Yeah. So you said
Yeah.
you were sketching out while you were in Japan, and it gets sort of it leads me to a similar question of when you're starting. Do you sketch? So did you have a laptop with you when you were sort of sketching in Hammer, or did you physically draw? What's sort of your process of that like sketching early design period?
Typically I love to just kind of put my stuff down on like paper and pencil. I'm very I think it kind of just like is something that really kept up with like over the years. So like when I was like in the middle of like middle school or high school, I would just be like I take a whole piece of paper, just draw up a layout, and then like I would I would kind of just like fine tune it over time. And then once I'm like satisfied with it, I would like throw it down, put it in Hammer,
Mm-hmm.
and then just like run across the map and see how that plays out. And then from that point on, it's all just like in Hammer work.
Sure.
But yeah, that's pretty much like the case with like when I was designing the map. So I had generally like designed out routes for like middle B site and A site for the most part. And then before I kind of stopped working on it before the contest got
Mm-hmm.
announced. Um but that's generally my kind of my thought process when it comes to it. I just draw it up basically because I think I have like I've drawn a lot as like a kid, so like kind of drawing up layouts for me is just like the most natural, and it's the easiest way for me to kind of set up proportions in some ways.
Sure. Yeah. So do you moving through the contest now? We're in the second stage, which is so for those not aware, the Mapcore is running a contest for making competitive CS:GO CS2 maps, and there's a prize for it. We're currently in the second stage. There's around 50 maps in the second stage, and the second stage is all based around design, and they've already passed the layout test in theory at this point, and so they're moving into the aesthetic design, making sure everything works visually, making sure there's no visibility problems, all of that. It's really the final stage. There is another stage afterwards, but this is sort of getting your map game ready. Is it just you working on it, or do you have a team? I know some people started on their own, picked up some other people. What's your situation in this second stage?
Yeah, I think like early on, I was reached out by a couple people, or someone reached out to me, and I reached out to someone else, and we've kind of like set up a little team together. Um, the most of the art direction is decided kind of by the environment artist working on the map, Ethers and Axis, who have just done an absolutely amazing work in kind of fleshing out and really envisioning the map into kind of what it is basically. Some of the parts of the map are definitely more inspired by the real life locations
Mm-hmm.
than others. But kind of feels, but the map feels just as authentic, basically. And they kind of do a lot of the work in deciding like what kind of the theme and like how certain parts of the map should look like. I did try to initially have like a clear idea, but I think like you definitely want to have like you definitely want to give them freedom to really like flesh out and to really envision it, because I think for them as well, they'll reasonably understand like, oh, this part of the map should look like this because the rest of the should look like this.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of just have to give them that room basically to really like let their creative juices flow. And I'm not really super experienced in like environment art myself. I'll try to help clean up things as much as possible though. And but I mostly and also I guess for me as well, I don't get to keep my hands on too much just because I got to let them cook a bit.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
it is definitely like every time I do see their work, it's just absolutely amazing, and I'm thankful for like having been able to make a team with them basically.
Yeah. Did you provide them with reference images from your trip, or are they sort of similarly interested?
Yeah, I definitely took a lot of like reference images when I was there in Japan, and I made sure to include them for kind of like the generalized design. But I think just because it also is a very popular like, especially like the Taisha itself, I think like because it is a very general like popular tourist attraction,
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of good reference images for that. I think like when it came to working on the onsen, it was definitely a bit harder just because there were kind of less obscure, there were more like obscure like sources to kind of find stuff in. um and I mean, we've changed the art direction kind of since, with like it no longer being based off of the original place I had visited.
Right.
But it just, I think like what the references that my team does have in terms of like wanting to flesh out the map with are pretty good. And I think like, yeah, I think like I said earlier, it does make it feel just as authentic as it
Mm-hmm.
ever has been.
It looks really great. Yeah, and I mean, I played. I don't know how early a version it was. It was while we were still in stage one, and it was even then. It looked really, really great. Definitely, you sort of see the inspiration coming in. I remember you had a little model on one of the sites of what I assume is the Taisha. Um, yeah, it just looks really nice. Um, yeah, how have you found the Mapcore contest? This experience. It sounds like you did the exotic places one as well, right? So is there any
Yeah.
way that they've differed, or
I think like definitely having a, I think 5 years of kind of map making in between this have definitely like helped me shape a better way as to
and a
how I kind of go
significantly
about it.
better engine as well?
Yes, for sure. The differences between like Source and Source 2 are just like astonishing, and it is just at this point it is unbelievable like how I was able to deal with mapping and Source in the first place. Um but I think like definitely my mentality, I've taken a better effort. I think like it really helps that there are like so many other different discords that you can kind of reach out to for like playtesting feedback. So I gotta also shout out, like obviously we got a lot of playtests on Mapcore, but also wanted to shout out to like Map Inc. or Eagle
Mm-hmm.
One especially for really helping me kind of get like playtests going. And um they really help kind of, with certain situations like, oh, you can't get a schedule on Mapcore, then you get one on Mapping. Or
Sure.
if you were looking for more reasonable times and like in America, then go for Eagle One.
Yeah, because they're
um
based in EU times, Mapcore, right?
yeah, for the
Yeah.
most part. But I think like So I think like beginning and also like having a better idea as to how I want to flesh out my feedback, um, based off of like we're getting it, receiving it, and then also just like working on the map and keeping true to the parts that I really want.
Hmm.
Um, I've had a clearer vision of, and I do think like the way that this competition is much more structured, it in some ways it does feel a lot more like kind of time consuming. I think just because there are like there are certain parts of it that are still a little bit unclear as to how they're necessarily judged. They
Sure.
haven't like
Yeah.
released like the metrics as to how good like a layout is and how much you need to modify it. But I think for the most part though, like at least you have an idea that you can reasonably keep on working on this map and that it will still be good, or like it will be considered decent within like the judge's eyes at least.
Yeah,
So
the
I think
getting
that's
through the
definitely a
first
motivating
stage,
factor.
I feel like definitely is a nice little ego boost of your map is not terrible.
Yeah, but there definitely are like some ones that I like found pretty interesting, and it was like a shame that they didn't really make it through. Um, but hopefully the creators of those maps like do eventually get back to them and do kind of flesh them out. But I think it is definitely like a nice little secure like safety net for us to kind of know that okay, like in some ways this map works basically. We're not sure how well it works, but you know it works to some extent.
Yeah, it doesn't not
And
work.
so,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Um but yeah, I think just kind of having a better mindset about it definitely this time around has, and kind of growing older has helped me kind of have a better way of going about this one compared to how I was just way too lost with working on like Luau for 2019.
hmm. Do you feel encouraged that Valve seems to be putting a more heavy emphasis on new maps? Obviously, we've had something like 6 community maps over the last few months added in. We had started off with FM Pone's, oh, forgive me, his new map, Terra, and another one we had in, and then some Wingman maps, and now they've just switched them out with Basalt, which I believe was a CS:GO port, and Eden, who I think was for CS2. Does that give you some encouragement about mapping? Did it sort of give you a push to carry on uh, focusing on Counter Strike? Because I assume you probably have some other game design interests.
Yeah, definitely. I think like knowing or definitely like the emphasis on community maps, and I do think that this is my personal opinion, but I do think like Valve are trying to kind of go away from trying to incorporate like old Go maps that have been ported over just as like simply as have, or like I feel like the only one so far that has like really been the case of this has been specifically Basalt.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like there are like some definitely like some certain map ports that I do think are reasonable in terms of like how much they freshen up the layout. So like I would like to hope to see like agency make a return into kind of into
Because they've
CS
started
again. Just
playtesting for that recently, right?
yeah, I think so. Like they just recently re-released it. And I think it definitely is like I think like if Valve are taking the direction that they are in terms of like wanting to focus more on like new fresh ideas, I think that definitely gives like a better, it definitely is very motivating because it's like okay, like I have my map can kind of have a chance to shine in comparison to people. I feel like a lot of the CS community are very nostalgia based, and they think like
Yeah.
it's easy for them to because I argue with like some of my friends about this all the time that don't really have like game design backgrounds, but like they're like, oh, I really want this old map back, and like I don't get why Valve didn't just like port this over and anything. And I feel like there's just such there's like there's a big difference between just like wanting to just like dump in the old shit again just to satiate like how players feel versus like really wanting to like focus on like new concepts
Mm-hmm.
or at least like something fresh again basically. And I think like the way that Basalt was kind of like changed up a bit, definitely like it does feel fresh. And same with agency especially. I'm actually I remember I have like friends that were like really crying about agency, and to see them really like take the time to remake that map, I honestly do respect it, and I think it's good. But I do think that there should be definitely be a focus towards like I think Valve should definitely be focusing towards like introducing new maps just so that people just so that the new mapping community does have a chance to actually like really get their feet into the ground and to actually have like a chance for their maps to show up in the game, basically.
Yeah, this is going to sound contradictory, but do you have an old Valve map that you'd like brought in? Obviously, there's still a few, and I'm including cache in old Valve maps. There's obviously a few that haven't made the move over. You know, Cobble, Cache, Train just came back in, but you know, there was even some of the, you know, I've got some friends who are really sad that Aztec didn't make it into CS2. Is there any that you'd like to see them bring back, or do you just pure focus on community maps would be exactly what you want?
I do have some preferences for old maps. I do think in terms of like the quintessentials that should return, like definitely something like I assume like based off of if we're basing it off of like the quote unquote train leak, basically where they showed which maps are coming in.
Mm.
I do think they're reasonable to come in. So like Assault, I guess. I guess you could remake Assault without like
That's
how
the craziest
bad
one.
of a map that is. Yeah. But like I think Lake reasonably so. Cobblestone I have enjoyed a lot when I played it. When on definitely on the old iteration, of course. Um,
That being
but
before they did the sort
before they
of
fucked it up with
Halloween
Halloween, yeah.
changes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But definitely Cobblestone I am looking forward to. I really do hope that they do. Even though it is like a very much like non-traditional map, I think that's what makes it fun though, because it is such a non-traditional map and the way that you're able to like work the space at times. Like the struggle to fight on that map is like crazy every single time, but I think that's what makes it fun, to be honest. Just like how kind of weird of a like kind of layout choice it is. That I definitely want to see those ones, that's for sure. And there might be like a couple other like kind of like workshop community maps that have been like um that did briefly appear in the game, and I
Yeah,
guess
and
I can't really
operations or
think of
whatnot.
that off the top of my head right now, but like I think when they if they do pop up, I think it would definitely would be something nice. Like I think like I'm really happy to see that like um kind of how Thera was remade from Santorini, and just like how
Yeah,
Epipone was able to really like reshape it again. And obviously I guess I would kind of be wrong not to say that like I am not looking forward to the Cash remake, which I honestly feel is like very soon, to be honest, but it's looking really good.
I was super convinced that you know when everyone was saying, "Oh, it's going to be Train, it's going to be Train," I was so convinced it was going to be Cash because FM Pone was he had all the pictures on Twitter. He'd really ramped up. Like there was like two pictures for a year, and then over the last 3 months, he added like loads of different places. And I was like, right, Valve has told him he's got to have it ready so to be added after this major, and so I was so convinced. And then obviously it's Train. But yeah, it's got to be coming soon. He posted most of them now, right?
Yeah, I think for the most part also just the fact that we are closer to 2025, which is when he was um
Was that his
kind of
goal?
his like slated release date as well, just like really, really not put the nail in the coffin, basically, in terms of like, okay, like this is like we are pretty close to getting it for the most part. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
How do you feel about the visual changes that have gone on in most of the maps? Like, it seems that Valve's had a clear view of how they want CS2 to look. How do you feel like? Do you like that compared to how CS:GO looked, or do you? I know sort of. There's an odd thing of Inferno seems to have really brightened up in the new version, whereas something like Train has really they've really darkened it. Is there sort of yeah? I guess what's your opinion on the visual direction that Valve's gone?
I guess I would like classify it under the quote unquote Valoranification of Counter Strike,
Yeah.
but I don't really have much of an issue with it because I do think like at a fundamental level it does work for a reason, right? There's a reason why Valorant hasn't needed to really do too many like asset flips in terms of like how their buildings look in terms of their color, because
Mm-hmm.
it generally is like the color palette for the game is like does work for being able to like have like pretty good like visibility. And like I know some friends of mine that have like are like, oh, I kind of miss like the old grimy feel of the game and everything. But I think when you're coming from a more competitive standpoint, it definitely like does help in some ways. Obviously there are like certain visibility issues in like certain places, and that
Mm-hmm.
definitely is contributed by like agent models or whatever. But like,
Yeah.
what can you do? Like, that's just part of the map. That's just part of the game now, and you just have to really like keep that in mind when it comes to like balancing, and really just need to make it a lot more clear. At least like everything, I feel like shouldn't be looking just as so white. Basically, like it should have like there should be some like theme, and there should be some spice into the map basically. And I think like the way that Valve have approached it so far, I don't really have too much of an issue with it. Like, I guess quote unquote it does look cartoony, but I think like from a competitive standpoint though, it is simply just a game. And I think from a competitive standpoint, it helps just to have like a better
Mhm.
kind of idea of like visibility in terms of like what you can and cannot see.
Yeah. So, what are your future plans? Obviously, finish this map for the contest. Hopefully, it does well. Either way, it'd
Um
be great to finish it.
yeah.
You looking at remaking Villaggio? Focusing on that, or you want to start a new one? Maybe take a break from CS. So what are your plans?
Yeah, I definitely want to kind of get a chance to kind of revisit my older Go maps. Definitely Villaggio for sure, Luau as well. And I do want to kind of also try to jumpstart some other ones I had in mind, like that I haven't been able to really touch yet. Um, but I think definitely being able to no longer required to really focus in on one project like consistently over 1 year, like at an exceeding speed, I would say would definitely be nice. Kind of allowing me to kind of also like get better skills at like modeling and like try to take my hand at like environment art basically.
Yeah.
Um, just because I am someone that kind of constantly like finds myself really busy, so resting up isn't just something that isn't for me.
Hmm.
But I would definitely just try to keep on mapping as much as possible, just to see, just because I want it to really like test myself and to see how far I can keep on going, basically, in terms of like how my creative juices flow, and to see how many like how I can make like how I can make this game fun for me in some ways, just like by like thinking outside the box in terms of like how my layouts are structured and whatnot.
Nice. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Is there anything you'd like to share? I know you've got YouTube. Anything you want to plug?
Um, I guess I guess my YouTube is youtube.com/AlphaOwl. I put a lot of work on there. I take a lot of work on there, whatnot. So yeah, I even upload some like trailers for for my maps as well.
Nice.
Um, but I definitely want to shout out the environment artists that are helping me work on the map. Ethers and Axis have absolutely been amazing. They've done tremendous work, and they're definitely cooking. They're definitely cooking in for like the next few weeks or next few months, basically, just to try to get this map up so that way we're ready for the end of stage two. And every time I like look at their work, it's absolutely astonishing. So I just wanted to shout them out for that, and I also wanted to shout out Eagle One as well for kind of having a very open community, having very convenient playtesting schedules, and kind of like giving American map makers like a sense of home, basically, in comparison to I, not to say that like Mapcore, Mapink are any
No,
different,
no,
but
it's
I think
just it's
like
good. The NAC
yeah,
needs all the boost it can get. Yeah.
yeah, and I think but like definitely having something where like North America could basically kind of convene together and to just to play maps, test them out, and to work all together basically. So, yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Good luck on the contest.
Thank you. You too.